It's good to see you, Father.
Hi.
Place correctly.
So, welcome. Good afternoon, evening. Some of you survived presidential and candidate motorcades, I hear, in the area. But here we are, and we are so glad that you're here and made it. This is the opening session of a test of faith, a summit to defend democracy. I'm Jim Wallis, and I'm here as the first inaugural holder of the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Chair in Faith and Justice, and the founding director of our Center on Faith and Justice, which is sponsoring the summit. So I welcome you to 125 E Street, which is a new address for a lot of us, the new home of the McCourt School of Public Policy, here on Georgetown's newly named Capitol campus. So we're glad you're here. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the George Family Foundation and Protect Democracy. Their generous support helped make this summit possible. So following the session tonight here, we have a reception hosted in the Capitol View Room. Now, I've been up there a few times. It's a wonderful view. So I hope you can come and join us to hang out together after the session. Wait till you see the view. Tomorrow, our summit will continue with our first session starting at 9 a.m. Registration and a light breakfast will be available starting at 8. We hope you'll be able to join us for a full day of programming tomorrow. So we start our summit this evening with a panel discussion on Christian faith and democracy. Earlier today, a statement was released titled Christian Faith and Democracy, which was signed by over 200 national faith leaders from across all of our religious traditions. Yeah, that's worth an applause. We went to some scholars and teachers at universities here and elsewhere to write this, but a lot of Christian leaders have signed it across a broad spectrum, and we're very happy for that. Now, if you want to sign it, you can by visiting www.faithanddemocracy or by scanning the QR code on the back of your summit badge. Isn't that cool? This is stuff that my sons know how to do, and I just am learning. But right here on the back, you can scan that and sign the statement. So you're welcome to join us. This is a statement about not just signing a statement, but how to send a message and how to use it, how to help frame this conversation in our congregations across the country and in all of our communities. The statement offers a Christian theological defense of democracy. Say theological very strongly here. We've got lots of politics in the air, but this is a theological statement of direct opposition to the twisted, anti-democratic, bad theology of white Christian nationalism. Some applause for that would be good. Some of my friends think the answer to bad religion is no religion. There are days I think that too, to be honest. But we're saying no, the answer to bad religion is better faith, good theology. So read the statement. If you'd like to sign it, and more important, use it, please do that. So this summit is really about the faith factor in this election, which I think could be decisive. What we as Christians can do to ensure the protection and the expansion of democracy in this country moving forward, and what action we'll take. Theology should lead to action. The statement is about what we believe and how we should act. The statement starts with this: the United States confronts a crisis of democracy, and the American church confronts a test of faith. Democracy stands embattled, facing new threats within our nation and new challenges all around the globe. While the two are deeply intertwined, tonight we want to focus on the test of faith. Tomorrow we'll pick up more on the threats to democracy, the test of democracy itself. So we are honored to be joined by a group that was integral in the drafting of this document and now signing it, who are all signers, here to help us understand the themes of this statement. And what was fun this morning was a lot of us on the calls, weekly calls for months and months and months, which we really enjoyed, but meeting each other for the first time, which was fun. Oh, you're taller than I thought. So that was a real joy, and some of you said, I've missed our calls. So here we are back again, and you're going to hear from these drafters about why this was so important for them to do. Now, I will note that we are all speaking in our own personal capacities and not on behalf of our various institutions or organizations. We are not speaking on behalf of all of the signers of the statement, just for ourselves as signers. That clear? So, you are lucky to have this group. I've been on the phone, texts, emails, in between, and the get-together now is, for us, it's a lot of fun. So before I introduce the panel, I want to say that Bishop Michael Curry of the Episcopal Church was also going to speak on the panel tonight, but unfortunately he's fighting the flu and was unable to join us. He just sent me a note and wishes us all the best. So, let me introduce this panel. It's pretty amazing. E.J. Dionne Jr., that's the guy on the far right, or far left, depending on your point of view. He likes to be confused sometimes. Is a distinguished university professor in the foundations of democracy and culture at Georgetown, and the McCourt School of Public Policy, and a senior fellow and Harriman Chair in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution. He also writes a syndicated column for the Washington Post, which a lot of us like to read. Dr. Kristin is a professor of history and gender studies at Calvin University and fellow at the University of Notre Dame's Center for the Philosophy of Religion. Historian, philosopher, author, she's all in one. Dr. Nichole Flores is associate professor of religious studies at the University of Virginia, where she is also the director of the Catholic Studies Initiative and co-director of the Forum on Religion and Democracy. See, we only chose qualified people to write this statement. Reverend Terri Hord Owens is the general minister and president of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the United States and Canada. She is a graduate of the University of Chicago Divinity School, and I often kid her and say, you know, most denominations, they say I'm Presbyterian or Episcopal. They say I'm a disciple of Christ. It's a lot to live up to, but we're glad that she is here. So we got a great group. We got a great group here, and we're going to give you a chance to ask questions of the panel. We're going to talk for a while and then give you a chance to have a conversation. This is about a conversation the nation needs to have. So let's have that conversation tonight. And I don't want you to go out saying, wow, what a great conversation on faith and politics. The altar call is to take this conversation out to the streets, to our congregations, to the places where the discussion is occurring. What's the faith factor is our question for tonight. So let's give the panel some love here. So a question for all of you. Let me start by asking each of you to share briefly about why you were compelled to write and sign the statement. Where do you see us currently in this moment of crisis and urgency, and what are some of the long-term considerations even beyond an election? Anyone to start?
Kristin, go ahead.
We're not shy on phone calls, so we shouldn't be shy here.
Okay, I'll start. I mean, what compelled me to join this effort was you. You compelled me through the invitation, the arm twisting. And I mean, I've said this to you before, but most people know Jim as a faith leader, and I'm a historian of American religion, so I know him primarily as a historical subject. And a historical subject that I respect very much. You have been in this fight for more than half a century. So getting the call was hard to say no, but I still tried. And because I'm not a theologian, and I'm not a pastor, I'm just a historian. But I'm a historian of American religion, particularly white evangelicalism. So I have something to bring to the table of this discussion, but I'm also, my outside field in graduate school was actually 20th century Germany, with a focus on the Holocaust and the German Christian movement. So throughout my research on the history of evangelical politics and power, I have always had those questions and that context in the back of my mind. And I think this is an urgent time for the American church more broadly, for American citizens, that we need to confront what is right in front of us. And there's a lot of complacency, a lot of sense of it can't happen here, and that complacency can lead very, very easily to complicity. And I see so many co-laborers here in the room, so many familiar faces, and I'm eager to reach out even more widely and compel others to join in this effort.
Well, I guess we'll just go down the line. So the reasons for me beyond, just that, I study Catholic theology and democracy in relation to each other as my life's work. The reasons for me signing are deeply personal. A primary kind of foundational one that I've shared with a few of you today is that it's my grandma. Her name was Maria Guadalupe Garcia Flores, and she was a migrant woman who resided in a middle-of-nowhere town in western Nebraska for her life, well below the radar of the formal institutions of democracy, such as the ones on full display as we look outside from the reception tonight. We'll be able to see the Capitol. This was not a place where she'd ever went in her life, or a place where honestly she would ever be welcome or expected to be unless it was in some sort of service role. So for her to have lived her life on the edges of our democracy really sticks with me, because even in that, her life really exuded not just Catholic, but democratic values in the way that not only did she care for her family as, a good mom and eventually a good grandma to her many, many grandchildren, but the way that she instilled values of justice and care for the poor in us, the way that she reached out to her community and modeled something that within Catholic social thought we often call subsidiarity. She really wanted to think about that little little town of Mitchell, Nebraska, and what needed to be done and what resources could be leveraged within that place to care for the people there. And she, just in her life, and especially in her name of Guadalupe, any of you who are familiar with the story of Our Lady of Guadalupe know that her appearance to Juan Diego was one both of consolation, but also of empowerment, of helping him to see himself as fully capable of participating in his society, and that was radical for someone who was the lowliest of the low in Mexican society. So her story really sticks with me as I'm doing all of these, academic things in my job, but a more proximate motivation for me. And when I got the letter, there was also a little bit of, it was coming from David Hollenbach, who is my professor, and you can't really say no when David Hollenbach asks you to, help out with democracy. But I, as someone who works at the University of Virginia and was living in Charlottesville in 2017, the violence that my community not just witnessed in those days, but that we continue to carry with us, the political violence, lest we forget the events of Charlottesville, which, as the people involved with the movement on the ground like to remind us, it was not just a moment, it's a movement that has launched in Charlottesville. But we should not forget that the violence of that day, the political violence, wasn't just random weird guys with tiki torches and shields cosplaying showing up in our city. It was in response to a democratic decision and a democratic process initiated by the city of Charlottesville to remove Confederate monuments from our public spaces. It was a democratic process that was contested. It was one where disagreement was allowed to be expressed in various fora, and people did express that disagreement. And when all was said and done, instead of agreeing to be a part of that democratic process and agreeing to remain a part of this peaceful community, there was a decision to enact violence. And of course that violence has been a forerunner for so much of the political violence that we've seen in the United States and even around the world since then. So for me, that really resonated with me and compelled me to give away an hour or so each week for months on end to this project. But like Kristin said, I'm really glad that I did.
And you live there.
Yes.
And this happened outside your door. Mm-hmm. And that shaped, you told us, that shaped your involvement in this process.
Yeah.
I lead a mainline denomination that the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. It is the only mainline that actually has its roots in America, founded as a result of a revival on the prairie at Cane Ridge in Kentucky, two Scottish Presbyterians, Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone. So there is this legacy of rugged American individualism, which can be the bane of one's existence if carried too far. And yet this understanding of Christian unity and not desiring to create fracture and owning a great deal of theological diversity. Our church, we celebrate communion every Sunday, and it's not a matter of frequency. It's a matter of the theology of the table saying that all are welcome at the table. Our identity statement says that we are disciples of Christ, a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world. As part of the one body of Christ, we welcome all to the Lord's table as God has welcomed us. I've been a frequent conversation partner at the various gatherings of the Faith Table, a group that Jim and Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner and others who I see here are part of, and Adam Taylor, and so many people across an ecumenical swath of Christianity. It's important to me that the church that I lead live into what it says it is. I say, let's be the church that we say we are. If we honor theological diversity, first of all, we have to have theology. Mainline Christianity, and I grew up in the traditional Black Baptist church and came to Disciples as a young adult with my mother and my siblings. Disciples, that openness, and for many mainlines, our commitment to a form of social justice is often seen as just doing good works and not grounded in theological precepts that we can articulate. as a pastor, I said, oh, we need to start Bible study. And well, we're not evangelical. Well, we are Christian, are we not? And so therefore, we need to be familiar with the Christian text. And I hope that this statement, by signing on to it, and there are other ministers in our denomination who have signed on to it, that we understand the importance of being able to frame these issues theologically. Theologically, there are lots of ways to do good in the world. There are lots of ways to fight for justice in the world. There are lots of places you can go to have a good cup of coffee on Sunday. You don't need to come to church. I know folks who come for the coffee and the conversation and say, oh, Pastor, that was a good talk that you gave. This work is kingdom work. It is really about how we live out what we hope, the difference that Jesus made by Jesus being in the world. Isaiah 11 is probably one of my favorite Advent scriptures because it talks about the peaceable kingdom. And I think we should be looking at all of this work as Christians. How do we bring about that world that we imagined would be possible because of the Messiah? And this statement gives pastors who are afraid to talk about these things in the pulpit some language. And hopefully it's a challenge that we all need to be able to have a theology we can speak to. Quite honestly, you don't have to be a scholar to have theology. You don't have to be a scholar to express your theology. It's simply making sense about what you believe about God and about Jesus. And I think this statement has legs. It has a language that will allow people to express their faith in really important ways, whether you're in the pulpit or whether you're in the pew, and help us really focus in on the fact that we really are called to make justice happen, to walk humbly with God, but to participate in this society and bear witness is really Jesus' work. It's not the work for other people, it's the work of the church.
Just so you know that this actually involved genuine religious and theological conversations, it was often the case that the Protestants wanted more scriptural sightings, the Catholics wanted more reference to tradition, and the Orthodox were a little bit of both. So it was the real deal. I got involved in this in part because I more than 50 years ago, I discovered, as many of us have through his writings, there was this guy in the world called Jim Wallis. And I hadn't met Jim Wallis, but I started reading him and found that he spoke to me, challenged me. And I was very excited some years later when I finally got to meet this guy, Jim Wallis. And was even more excited when we finally, after decades of doing various kinds of work together, we found ourselves in the same place here at Georgetown University. And we started talking when he started his new center about democracy and about the need for a vigorous theological defense of democracy in this moment. And I was so excited when Jim got this notion of putting out this statement and bringing together a whole lot of people to begin the drafting process. I know the word is out there now, and it's become a very political word. It was a real joy to do this. I love seeing joy in the conversation. One of my favorite book titles. It is. In fact, I was going to say one of my favorite book titles is C.S. Lewis's Surprised by Joy. And I've thought about that concept all my life. And it was a really remarkable group of people. Some of us actually look better in the little boxes. Everybody else in the group doesn't. I also appreciate the Zoom period because it's the only time in my life where people said, please unmute yourself. And so, but we had extraordinary conversations, arguments of a good kind. Argument should be a good word, by the way. It's become a bad word. Argument is an effort to give and receive help on the road to truth. And we had a lot of those kinds of conversations, and it was a very exciting enterprise. And for me personally, how did I come to this beyond the personal? It's that I think all of us know in this room that democracy is under challenge and threat in a way it has not been for some time. Democracy is always challenged. There are always people who want to overthrow democracy. There are always people who do not want to share power. We have seen throughout our history moments of real conflict over how democratic we really want to be. But this struggle has gotten more difficult with a combination, as Jim mentioned, of the rise of Christian nationalism, which is really an attempt to exclude a bunch of people from the public square or from their legitimacy in the society or from respect as children of God entitled to equal rights. We see it within my own Catholic tradition, where a debate many of us thought was settled at the Second Vatican Council, where the church really opened itself up to democracy after what happened in the 1930s and 1940s with the rise of Nazism and fascism, and some remarkable documents that came out of the Second Vatican Council. We thought this had been settled, but you're seeing again within the Catholic Church new arguments arising, challenging whether democracy is actually Catholic, whether it is actually Christian, often reverting to arguments from long ago. So I thought for that reason, it was very important to do this. And around the globe, you have people arguing in the name of Christianity to limit access to power, to limit access to equal rights. And we have seen within the Christian church before fights like this. The American Christian church was deeply divided over slavery. It's where all those northern and southern appellations for our various traditions came from. I believe that, and we're going to talk about this more, that while democracy was not the original recommendation of the Christian tradition, I believe it was a logical outcome of the reflection of Christian people and others on the nature of human beings, on the nature of equal rights, on the nature of God and how he views his creation, that democracy was a logical outgrowth of our tradition, that we should embrace it, we should defend it, and for those of us who are Christian, we should defend it within the terms of our tradition and to have conversations with our brothers and sisters about it, because right now we need a lot of those kinds of conversations and arguments because I think democracy needs a defense now to a degree that it hasn't needed it in a while, and we need to be there to defend it.
You seeing why we enjoyed this conversation? My students this week also raised maybe a third test of democracy, test of faith. It's also a test for a new generation. And a lot of students, I see students here, are saying to us, we're watching you. We're watching how students stand up or not, speak up or not, show courage or not. And whether, as I was told this week, whether we ever show up at any of your churches again will be in part because of how you stand up or don't, or speak up now. So we do a lot of back and forth, so we're going to start. I want to go to a few of you for particular things, but we can do back and forth as we do in the calls. So Kristin, you and I are from the white evangelical tradition, and we both get asked this question a lot. What about the evangelicals? You are deeply connected to and within that evangelical world. How do you see this statement as trying to disrupt the culture of white Christian nationalism in particular, and break through, perhaps break through, to some evangelicals, maybe a younger generation, and others who are perhaps open to the importance of defending democracy in the United States? What are the current dynamics within the evangelical world?
Well, first, if we look at survey data, what we know is that white evangelicals, more than any other religious demographics, tend to have a penchant for authoritarian leadership, higher levels of comfort with political violence, resistance to political compromise, and the list goes on. So this is a serious issue in evangelical spaces for a number of reasons. One, what we've seen is over the last decades, really, going back to the 1960s at least, and you could find roots going back further than that, an affinity for theological frameworks that prioritize hierarchy, order, and obedience. I mean, you could go back to the slaveholding religion and find that as well, but a real resurgence and emphasis on those concepts, authority and submission. And that has a strong hold inside some of these communities. And there is a powerful faction right now, a well-coordinated, networked faction within white evangelicalism, with influential figures in several denominations, with links to different political groups, conservative media, different organizations and think tanks that are pushing a Christian nationalist agenda in seeking to undermine pro-democracy inclinations across evangelicalism. And it's important to realize these power dynamics because there is right now a lot of pressure being exerted on what we may call moderate white evangelicals. And you can see this on the national stage. If you are on social media, or if you're following somebody like David French or Russell Moore, you can see what this looks like, and it's ugly. But this happens all the way down to the local church. If you listen in on NatCon at all, some of us do, they gave explicit instructions to folks in the audience to go back and pressure their pastors to get on board with this right-wing agenda. And if they don't, to end up leaving their churches. Right? There is all kinds of pressure from constituents and donors on evangelical organizations, schools, colleges, right, to toe this line. And so enormous pressure is being exerted. What we are doing in this statement, as it's directed to all Christians, to people of faith, people of goodwill. But I think for the white evangelical community, for folks who pride themselves in being Bible-believing Christians, who uphold the authority of the scriptures, this is handing them a biblical theology to remind them of the image of God and their command to love their neighbor as theirself, to love their enemies, to fear not, to tell the truth. These things that have to be called out, and these are precisely the core theological teachings that are being attacked. Just this week, I saw right-wing evangelicals contesting the idea of image of God, saying that's just part of this liberal post-war consensus, and that's a bad thing, by the way, and love your neighbor as yourself, doing away with that. That does not apply in this situation, explicitly taking on these teachings. And so this is an attempt to stand against that and to invite others to sign on and to stand against it. And if you read the statement, you will see there is a paragraph that says, for some people, signing this could entail risk. And I'm thinking of those folks in white evangelical communities, and that's why this is a moment to step up and courage.
Speaking of Bible-believing Christians, one of those Bible verses that got into our statement was Matthew 25, what I call the "it was me" text. Jesus saying, I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was naked, I was a stranger, I was sick, I was in prison. Stranger there literally means immigrant. That's what the word means. The text, refugee immigrant, that's what the word means. So back to you, Nichole, your grandmother is right at that point. And I got to say, we have an archetypal issue now in Springfield, Ohio, where legal Haitian immigrants are being lied about. And we've had bomb threats and violence threats, and anybody who's black in Springfield is afraid. And it's being used at a national political level. And I'm asking, why are the most people lied about, why are they always immigrants, migrants, refugees? Why is the lying so much about them? So as you, as a Catholic theologian, and your grandmother in mind, When you see Springfield happening and read about it every day in the news now, they've been doubling down. How does that make you feel?
It makes me feel so many different things, but I have to tell you, and if any of you who follow me on Twitter already have seen my tweet storm about this, or maybe you haven't because I don't have a blue check, so no one reads me anymore, but the day that this happened, and you can kind of see it coming a mile away for people who advocate for migrant justice. You could see it ramping up. You could see, the not just Donald Trump in the debate, not just J.D. Vance, but even before that, Ted Cruz retweeting, these cat memes, and it kind of started picking up this, the speed in ways that, I know people found baffling, but I was immediately nervous for the people of Springfield. But when things kind of culminated, it was, I was on my way actually last week back from another event at Georgetown from DC on my way back to Charlottesville, and I received a notification from my children's school saying that there had been threats of gun violence that were proven to not be credible, but they were, the county schools were just kind of giving us an update on what was going on. And of course, I'm at a Sheetz on my way back to Charlottesville and just, hyperventilating, thinking of my child sitting in that the first grade classroom. If he was in the room, he'd be so mad that I just said he was in kindergarten. But sitting in his first grade classroom, and just the feeling, that fear that I feel every time I release him in the morning. But connecting that back to Springfield, that fear of gun violence, there's a way that I think people in our current political discourse think that they can leverage political violence in a way that's very targeted, that's very focused, like that kind of violent rhetoric, like, oh, I'm not saying this about, our democracy in general. I'm just saying that, these people are other and these people are violent, and we are fine to show them hatred and to threaten them with violence or to actually commit violence against them because they are migrants, because they are Haitian. But we reap the whirlwind. We are sowing these awful, violent tendencies into our society, into a society that we want to live up to these democratic principles, and we're finding more and more that we cannot control what happens, right? When we speak in these ways. Now, I'm in here with some couple hundred of my closest friends, and I do feel vulnerable speaking about this because I think that there's also a lot of targeting of people, on the, trying to draw attention to this in the public square, saying, no, these issues are connected. The kind of hate and violence directed towards migrants is not just about migrants. Maybe that's my bottom line here. It's not just about migrants. And in that way, not only is the mistreatment of those who are trying to, and of course migration is a very complex phenomena, but people who are often seeking some form of refuge or some sort of new beginning in a place, that they are important to our democratic life. They do bring resources, not just of labor, which is often talked about, but of ideas, of energy, excitement for democratic traditions that revivify what we're doing here. But also there's a need to think about the violence that they're experiencing within this broader context and how that can be corrosive in our democracy as well.
And the lying and the violence is targeted on migrants who are people of color, the non-white violence, and who are racially different from the people who are the angry white base that's prompting all these lies. So,
could I say something about that? Because I like everybody, I find what's happening in Springfield appalling and troubling and just basically evil, what is happening. We should remember that as a country, we have been arguing about this for a very, very, very long time. And in ways, at some moments, I find this saddening, and in other ways, I find it heartening. Heartening because we have overcome this on a number of, again and again. But I think one of the things that bothers me a lot about what's happening in Springfield is, in the immigration debate, you heard for many years, oh, we're just against illegal immigrants. We're not talking about other immigrants. We're only talking about those who broke the law and got here illegally. And you say, okay, we understand that. You can sort of hear that and respect it as if, I think one's first instinct should be to take people at their word. And I think for some people that was true. But now in Springfield, you have a whole community not only that is there legally, but that was invited in to help revitalize the community. And here you have these lies told about a community that was invited in. And the other thing that bothers me a lot about this debate is a whole lot of us came in earlier waves of immigration where a lot of people didn't want us either. And when you look back at how the Irish were treated when they first came in, or how the Italians or the Poles, my French Canadians coming down from Quebec, Portuguese, Czechs, Swedes, there was a lot of pushback against immigration through our history. We used to have open borders until the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s, and then a really tough immigration bill passed, fundamentally racist immigration bill passed in the 1920s. And then we opened up immigration again in 1965. That's a long time, but we passed the 1965 Act. So here's the hopeful thing I like to keep in mind. We've gone through these cycles as a nation. When you had the backlash against immigration in the 1920s, it followed the highest period in our country's history of foreign-born people, around 13%, as I recall. We're now at about 14, 15% in our country, so we're having another backlash. But we worked our way through that, and I think it's very important to defend the rights of immigrants now, to understand that, yes, there are, if we're not going to have open borders again, which I don't think we will, and which most Americans don't want, we are going to argue about how many folks do we let in? How do we decide that? These are all legitimate arguments to have as a democracy. What's not legitimate is to demonize people the way is going on in Springfield, to overlook the fact that those immigrants have helped increase the economic vitality of that community. And again, to go back to our statement, to recognize that we are all children of God, because I appreciated Kristin bringing up this idea that there are now real attacks on core scriptural teachings, including that people are made in the image of God, and core American teachings that they are endowed with rights by their Creator, and we've got to keep standing up for that.
So let's keep going back to the Bible here. Terri, you and I remember a lunch conversation a few months ago with several other of your communion heads. We were at the table, and we were talking about all this, and one of your colleagues told the story, saying that the pastors in their denomination were pushing back because their congregants were pushing them on even what scriptures they were putting out for the Sunday services. Which scriptures? And the pastor said, and she said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, I didn't say Trump. I didn't say Biden back then. I didn't say politics. I just had a scripture in the bulletin." And they said, this scripture really critiques and undermines a particular candidate. And she said, "What scripture?" He said, "It was the Beatitudes." So how are your pastors I mean, you are the first African-American woman to head a communion in this nation. And you've got 80% white people in your church. So you're a pastor and a prophet, I think you're both. So how do we get pastors to speak on these things when they're afraid because of all that blowback?
This is a real issue. It's a real issue. And part of the reason it's real is, again, because of that rugged American individualism, which is so core to any denomination that has a congregational polity, right? There is no episcopal government, no bishop telling you where to go, where to be, or what to think. And when you look at the map of the disciples in particular, we have greatest density in the states that we would label as red states. We were part of the land grab in the Western expansion. We paid to have wagons and horses in Oklahoma to grab land for our churches. That's why there's so many disciples in Oklahoma and Texas and that center core of the Midwest and the plains. Not as big in the Northeast, but certainly on the Atlantic seaboard and then on the West Coast. And over the years, this conflation of Christianity with this American civil religion of individualism, which has shown up in a lot of ways. Christian nationalism is not new. We used to have a mantra that we don't use quite as much, but in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, liberty, in all things, love. Where the scriptures speak, we speak. Where the scriptures are silent, we are silent. One of our founders, Alexander Campbell, didn't speak against slavery, and we will pride ourselves for not having made that split, but he was silent on the issue because he said the Bible didn't speak about it. And he later said, as much as I love the black man, I love the white man more. We can't pride ourselves on holding these Christian ideals so high when they don't ring true when people hit the ground. When pastors are treated as hired hands in some of our churches, and I have met and prayed with many a pastor, usually a young white pastor, who is afraid to speak about any issue of justice, to preach on the Beatitudes or Matthew 25, or even to name issues of justice beyond let's make sure our food pantry is up and running. And those young people, and even some older people, are literally afraid for their jobs. That theological dearth of understanding is partly to blame for it. We think, I joke and say disciples, some of them have a chalice, which is our logo, on their door, and they have no reason, they don't understand why. Church used to be a thing that you did as a good, upstanding citizen, right? If you were of a certain class, you had a country club membership and you went to the right church on Sunday. And that's no longer the case because we don't join institutions in the same way that we do, but those institutions are not in us. The theology, if church is just a vehicle through which you think you're doing good things, as I said earlier, and not a life that you live in response to the relationship with however you understand the holy, then people who are trying to be prophetic are bumping up against people for whom this is Sunday coffee hour. We're more concerned about who's bringing the treats for coffee hour than we are about who is maybe going to show up down at the State House to lobby against a particular issue, not because it's an issue, but because it means that some people need to have places to live that they can afford, that people need to have wages that they can afford to feed their families, that real work of really being community. So we're bringing young people out of seminaries who are bright-eyed and fearless and want to do this work, and they're slamming up against the institutional residue of previous generations. We're not the 1980s corporate mainline church anymore. No one wants to come and join us and just sit in our pews and be on our committees. Young people want to do things that are relevant, that are meaningful. And as long as we allow this kind of spiritual dryness, dearth, I'm a pastor, forgive me, that's what it is. It's spiritual dryness, it's biblical illiteracy, and we have to figure out a way to speak against it. Christian nationalism showed up. That's what we had in Reconstruction. It's the birth of the Ku Klux Klan. It's the resurgence of the Klan in the early 20th century. I'm from Indiana. My great-grandfather was a small business owner in Indianapolis and a lithographer for the local black paper. He was approached by the Republican Party and was offered a great deal of money to help curry favor with black voters. And rather than do that, he moved to Franklin, Indiana, which, if you know Indiana, I'm not so sure that Franklin was much safer. But if you were in Indiana, the Republican Party was the Klan. Some people will argue that it probably, in some ways, it still is. But there hasn't been that push of independent thinking as people of faith to critique this conflation of Christianity with American civil religion. And if we don't understand our text, if we don't even know what it is we believe, if church is just another organization, then we're fighting a seriously uphill battle. And we have to keep doing that work to help people understand that what we're trying to do is live out something that's real. In the black church, the prophetic tradition is amazing to some people. I've attended the Conference of National Black Churches with other heads of communion who are white. And the freedom with which black ministers speak against the empire and their willingness to name issues of injustice. One of them said to me, I would never be able to do that. Black folks, for example, understand why Jeremiah Wright years ago said, "Goddamn America." That was not unusual. That's part of the black prophetic tradition that comes from being oppressed. And, we're not from here, but we were brought here. We didn't choose to come. We were brought. That's a whole different migrant kind of story. And the issue of race also undergirds a lot of this within the mainline organizations. We want to think we're more progressive than maybe other churches. Surely we are not racist. We have lots of our church claims that it's an anti-racist church. And yet the systems and the structures made it difficult for me, even as the first black woman to lead this tradition. The expectation is that I just simply come and fill a role and take on the mantle of the institution, as opposed to letting who I am help to transform the institution. So our young people are really struggling, and I keep saying 2 planks on the spiritual platform: spiritual practice and biblical literacy as Christians. If we don't do this, I don't care what your denominational influence is. As people of faith, we have to understand the foundations of the faith. And yes, we wrestle, we critically engage. Holy Spirit can speak to us and help us all to understand these things, but we can't let that be taken from us. And we can't let unity be the enemy. Ecumenical circles, unity, that doesn't mean we don't disagree. It's not unanimity. It simply means that we learn how to walk together when we disagree. And that's perhaps one of the hallmarks of my own tradition that we simply haven't figured out yet. We're more willing to just simply be quiet and not address the things. And we're preparing, there'll be a statement coming out under my name tomorrow about the Haitian issue, and have been on email for several days. The pastors in Ohio are outraged, want to speak. We have Haitian disciples congregations in New York and Florida, and people want to speak. And one of the leaders said, well, I'm not sure, will we face legal trouble down the road? And we wanted to issue it as a triumvirate of people who are authorized by our church to sign on denominationally. I can't sign the Christian Church Disciples of Christ to certain things. There has to be a triumvirate of leaders who agree. And I said, oh, what the heck? I will issue the statement under my name. Why are we afraid? Why are we afraid? We cannot be afraid. This is not the faith we profess. And so we have to be the church we are. And I think the mainline church really can learn a lot from communities of color around that, certainly from the black tradition in terms of just being willing to be the prophet. And Walter Brueggemann says that the job of the prophet is not just to critique the empire, but to create a vision of the alternate society that's possible. And that's where my heart is for the people that I help to lead, is that we have to be partners with God in bringing about this society that we say we believe that it's possible because of Jesus, but then we're afraid because we don't want to argue, we don't want to create division. And I'm really at a point where if you can't name truth and speak to truth and you want to leave, then I guess you'll just have to leave. because I'm not going to be silent, and I don't think the church can be silent. And this statement gives us language. We cannot be silent about these things. And so I just today, and some of my leaders this afternoon, between this morning and now, had to deal with someone who was afraid for us to speak truth on factual matters. This isn't opinion. These are factual things that have happened. And that, as the old folks will say, it grieves my spirit greatly. But we can't be afraid. I think being Christians, using this language, and that's what I say to my young pastors, if this is just a job, you need to find another job. And if this is really a calling, then perhaps there's a better marriage of pastor and people that you can find, a better way that you can serve. And we really do have churches that are abusing their pastors because they see the pastor as a hireling. And in congregational polity, that's more true than it is for you in Episcopal forms of government. So I'll say that.
So, yeah, go ahead.
I just
Nichole.
want to underscore a point here back to the original question and even the example of the Beatitudes being seen as partisan, that there's been this movement towards depoliticization of the faith, and I think a lot of that being guided by a sense that politics are bad. But actually, from Christian perspective, I would argue that politics are good. We are political animals. We are zoon politikon. We are seeking those opportunities to be in conversation in society together. So these examples of the way that you said, oh, church isn't just the country club and the church anymore. I don't know what churches you're talking about here. Oh, maybe the Disciples of Christ. That's what my parish is. That's what I love you all souls, but my husband's Protestant it sometimes manifests as that. Yeah, so we should make an ethical statement there if that's what, and a theological one if that's what we want to say. But how do they function right now as country clubs? Or the thing that you do before you go and watch football on Sunday. And my wonderful pastor at my husband's church always likes to say, if this is just the thing that you do on Sunday mornings, you are better off just going to brunch, because this is about faith. This is about faith in Jesus Christ, but that we turn towards making it into a cultural and a private and even something to be consumed in an economic sense it undermines the actual reality of politics at the center of our faith. Anyway, I wanted to add that.
That's good. Could each of you give me the sentence or the paragraph or the theme that most was significant for you in this statement? Just briefly, what really jumped out at you that made you want to do this? But some of you draft statements have done that before on committees. Normally it's, here are my edits. We just went on and talked like this for a long time. And I'm hoping the statement takes the conversation that we've had and sparks a conversation all over the country about these things. So just quickly, what did each of you most drawn to?
Sure. I'm going to grab this one before EJ does. We were partners in sin, and both kept pushing to get sin language in this document from our respective traditions. I'm the resident Calvinist on the drafting committee.
I was raised Catholic, and you know how guilty we are.
It works, yes.
Still,
and
guilty still.
And the importance of acknowledging in humility our own fallibility. And by our, I mean individually and collectively as people of faith, as Christians, and this really strikes at the heart of the logic of Christian nationalism. Because Christian nationalism divides us versus them. And the us there is not all Christians, but Christians just like them. And God is on our side, which means anybody who is critiquing any aspect of our agenda is not just our enemies, but an enemy of God. And then what happens is that because God is on your side, right, the ends justify the means because you're doing God's work in this world. And again, those enemies, right? And so there's this supreme confidence in one's own righteousness and wisdom and strategy and agenda, right? And that is theologically false, right? If you are a Christian, your theology says, no, sin runs through every human heart. And often it's the people who think they're following Jesus, who are taking Jesus' name and baptizing their own personal, prideful, selfish agenda, right, with that name. Those are the ones who are condemned by the scriptures. And the temptation is real, right? Scriptures teach us that that temptation is real and ever present. And so we need to engage politically with humility and aware of our own limitations. And this is the language that we put in with respect to our government. Democracy, checks and balances are there to keep any faction from pursuing their own interests, right? That's part of the logic of our system. The Constitution guarantees certain rights and protections to minorities. And this is what we are affirming here. And so I think that sin language is really key. Democracy is realistic, and we as Christians need to be aware of our own limitations and proceed humbly and collectively with people from other faith traditions and from no faith tradition in particular.
Can I just do a double-barreled sin here? So so the sinners on opposite ends here, the fellow sinners. By the way, when you were talking about church coffees, I'm from New England. I thought it was in Scripture that you have to have Dunkin' Donuts at church coffees, but perhaps I'm misreading Scripture here. It just shows you can have very particular readings of Scripture. When somebody begins a sentence, I never tire of quoting, you know they quote this way too often. And people in this group heard me quote this many times as we were having these conversations, but it is one of my favorite statements about democracy by a theologian, and it's Reinhold Niebuhr's famous declaration that man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible. Man's capacity for injustice makes democracy necessary. And I've always thought Niebuhr got it exactly right. Now we would say men and women, or our capacity for justice and injustice. Our capacity for justice makes democracy possible because that belief in justice is what makes us believe that every human being in a society should have an equal voice in how the decisions of that society affect their own lives, but also how that society should be shaped, whose interests should it serve, what values should it try to uphold. And those aren't easy questions, and we argue about those things, and there are legitimate arguments about those things, but everybody has a right to be in the game. And to have a role. And democracy is really radical that way. This is when you think about it. Now, in the other sense, the other side of democracy is simply crowdsourcing on a big scale. And if we loved crowdsourcing in so many other areas, why don't we remember that democracy is one big exercise in crowdsourcing? But as Kristin said, man's capacity for injustice makes democracy necessary. Rulers need to be checked. They need to be checked by the people. Rulers can make mistakes. Rulers can become corrupt. Rulers can become oppressive. And the people ought to have redress. And individual rights need to be protected. We're really talking here about liberal democracy. And individual rights need to be protected within that. And so I think remembering our capacity for sin is, again, proving I'm a Catholic, remembering our capacity for sin is really important. And just the last point I'll make, there's a whole view that if you are a progressive Christian, you believe in the infinite perfectibility of human beings and that you only think we can get better and better. And I do believe that we can get better and that, salvation is the other side of sin and transcendence is the other side of sin. But we can make big mistakes. We can really mess up. And when people in power do that, it can have enormous consequences. And we can even make the mistake of thinking that Dunkin' Donuts are recommended by Scripture.
That's for sure. I think we all are partial to the parts of the statement that we helped draft, but one that was particularly important to me, in part because of how personal the statement, of my participation in writing the statement was for me, is the section on religious pluralism. So in addition to me getting my start in theology in the context of a religiously plural movement, a peace movement that involved young women from Israel, Palestine, and the United States, and that just kind of being core to like my understanding of myself as a human, as a theologian, and as a person in politics. I'm also, and I was kind of implying this in my previous answer, and I realized I hadn't given the background. I'm in an ecumenical marriage, so I am a Catholic married to a person who came of faith in an evangelical background, and now is an elder at a wonderful Protestant church in Charlottesville that's not affiliated with a denomination. But for me to have been a part of this document, both in terms of how it was put together, that it was that ecumenism wasn't the afterthought. It was a part of the very fiber of this document. That to me really resonates, and I know that I'm not just the only, a Catholic theologian who's also a practicing Protestant in the world. Like that there's so many of us kind of living in these, betwixt and between spaces within the church who are going to resonate with parts of this document, but also that pluralism has a concrete, payout in the statement about the differences that the members of the committee have on actual political issues. And I don't want anybody who's reading this statement to think that that was filler or just a tip of the hat to say, oh, we're nonpartisan. No, there are genuine disagreements over really important policies among the people who participated in drafting the statement. That is not an exaggeration. And if we go upstairs to the reception and had talks about those, maybe we shouldn't, but those are genuinely held disagreements, but that the statement embodied both in its, in how we pursued it, so in its method, but also in its content, this commitment to religious pluralism, but also ecumenism, I think is really important to me, and I hope that will really resonate with all of you who are also living in the betwixt and between.
Terri, what jumped out at you?
I think the one that jumped out, I will say, and again, coming from my own denominational context, is the paragraph about the stranger and the enemy, and walking together with those who are not like us and also those with whom we disagree. Again, at the heart of unity is not unanimity, but I think when Jesus says, make us one in John 17, he's not just talking about holding hands and having a kumbaya moment. He's talking about the real hard work of following his example. And I think that's the greatest witness that we can make as Christians, is to model for the world what it looks like when we can indeed engage, disagree, and move together on a path forward. Various conciliar bodies of ecumenism in this country. Ironically, the one thing that we don't do, say at the World Council of Churches Central Committee, is have communion. And for us as a disciple, it's like, oh, you're not having communion. But everybody has different rules and different theologies that determine who can preside, who can serve, who can receive. And so we operate with agreement on other issues. And we're still the World Council of Churches, and we're still the National Council of Churches. I think it's really important for us as people of faith to model that practice of honest dialogue, deep listening. We're making some governance changes in our denomination to move away from a system where every 2 years there would be resolutions offered, a general board would review them, and 3 months before the General Assembly, at which every one of our congregations has voting representation. I think we're the only main line that allows every single congregation to have voting representation at the General Assembly.
That's very democratic.
Yeah, it is, it is. That rugged American individualism, congregational polity. And yet, we don't prepare one another to have those conversations. We don't know anything about the topics that are being raised. We will be triggered if someone uses a word that, because no matter where we are in the country, disciples are red and they're blue and they're purple and they're all over the map politically, sociologically, and even theologically. But we're trying to build an environment where we are discussing in between. We're now going to meet every 3 years, but online we're going to have listening and learning conversations so that the issues that are facing our communities, when we discern how does the church speak, how do we give theological framing to some of the important issues, that we learn how to have these dialogues, these conversations, so that we can not demonize one another, right? If we disagree, if you're my enemy, someone said to me, a member of our LGBTQ alliance said, but Terri, you're asking me to stay at the table. I'm always telling people, you got to stay at the table. You have a right to disagree, but you don't have a right to disengage. You got to stay at the table because that's the witness that we make. And I think that section, for me, as I live out my own ministry, is personally important. And I think that part will resonate with disciples of Christ and hopefully everyone, because that polarization, if the church can model, if Christians can model a way forward in terms of how to have the hard conversations and how to listen without demonizing, and that respect, which begins again with the Imago Dei, that we are all created by God, and everything that God made was good. You can't just stop. God created everything. We don't get to decide who God loves. It's all there. So,
I'd like to take some questions now from you all. The statement just came out today, so many of you haven't had a chance to read it yet, but you will. I want to commend it to you. But I want to ask you some questions, what you've heard so far, and your response. And I want the panel to get ready for my final question, which I want a brief answer to after the questions, which is we are 46 days away from Election Day. What is it that keeps you up at night, and what gives you hope? Ponder that one. That's how we're going to end. I see Barbara.
This conversation, but I'm really, I want to ask you about young people, because that's so much of the work that we do with the millennials. And the Washington Post, you know, the slogan, democracy dies in darkness, and Edmund Burke, evil thrives when good people do nothing, right? So young people, according to the data, are leaving churches, including the black church, because they're not seeing the public witness of the teaching of Jesus. They see the distortion and the lies and the fraud of what Jesus teaches. They don't see this on CNN and MSNBC, and most of the Democrats don't even act like they know God, let alone, and that's not true. So my question is, how do we, if evil die, you know, it's democracy dies in darkness, black and brown and Native American and Asian, they're looking at this a little bit different. This, for white people, this is like, this is not going to be good post-democracy. For some of us, it's like, we may not be here, because democracy is about who has a right to be here. How are you addressing that so that it's no longer Christian to be silent?
Yeah. Amen. Preach. I'll jump in as a resident millennial, the elder millennial in the room. One thing that I was mentioning to some other folks earlier today is that in my classrooms at UVA, there's a lot of you know, they're very diverse. You know, it's not it's a public institution. It's not affiliated with any particular religious group or even political group. It's, you know, here comes everybody, right? And I taught this class for a while called "Do We Have Faith in Democracy?" And the challenge of the semester was really just to answer that question and try to answer it by the end of the semester. And my students, left, right, and center, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, everybody, at the end of the semester, no, I don't have faith in democracy, because I don't feel like I have a voice or a place in this democracy, right? So in an interesting way, a parallel experience with what you're seeing and what all of us who are concerned with disaffiliation in our various denominations and churches are seeing with young people saying, or you know, we're quiet quitting. You know, we're leaving because why? But that leaving has tremendous consequences. And now I'm going to say this with love. This is a generationally diverse group, but one step that we can take towards maybe making people feel like they have a little bit of space at the table is stop treating millennials like we're the young people. We are in our mid-40s. With kids up here talking to you on the panel, right? This is not the, and Gen Z even is moving rapidly deep into adulthood, right? Opening up space at the table, opening up space at the table and not being willing to cede power to younger generations is essential to defending our democracy today. So I hope that was clear, but I say that from experience as someone with a baby face who is still treated like a young person in this society. But if we want our young people to invest, we have to treat them like the adults that they are and give them a seat at the table.
You're going to hear some younger voices tomorrow
yes.
about why democracy isn't felt to be working for those young people and how we have to not just save democracy, but transform it. Okay.
I just want to co-sign that, opening up the spaces at the table. We've made huge governance changes within our church that will be enacted after our General Assembly in 25 for that very reason. Moving from being dictated, there's one young adult on the general board of 100 people, to a broader crowdsourcing of gifts, talents, and skills, and a greater sense of diversity. And as I'm seeing younger people coming into decision making, they're being bolder about the changes that they see need to happen. They're being bolder in their prophetic witness, and they're being bolder about changing this institution that they are part of. And I'm happy to be the oldest one in the room. And today, when you do things, when you're willing to be brave and lead from a standpoint of bravery, they will go with you. And that's been my experience. So.
Could I take your question the other way around? Because I think it's really good. I'll be very brief. I think it's a real problem for churches right now that so many young people are being driven out because they perceive the church not simply as conservative, but actually as quite right-wing. I remember as a kid, you know, one of the priests at our wedding, his first act as a young priest was to lead his congregation in the March on Washington. I remember the Berrigan brothers, who were more radical than I was. Jim was more radical than I was, but they pricked my conscience and they moved my conscience. And that in those days within the Catholic Church was this big tent of real argument and contention, but we were all in there together. And I think there's a perception that Christian communities have narrowed down, and there's a process of kind of push and pull going on with young people. Some feel pushed out, some leave because of this perception that the Christian church is now quite consistently, in their view, I don't think it's true, and it's certainly not true of the Black church, and it's certainly not true of a lot of other congregations, but I think there's this perception that it's allied with forms of politics that they just can't accept, and that when they read the scripture, they say, gee, this doesn't seem to match what this says over here. And so I think this is a problem for society, but it's a real problem for the churches, too.
Barbara's point about how different people are looking at this election. We were on a call together recently, and went around the circle, what's going to be your issue after the election? An African-American woman, powerful leader, just said, survival. And a lot of folks in the call said, what do you mean? I thought it was going to be a bill or a policy. No, survival. So how differently people see it is critical. I see a hand here. Young man right there, yep.
Thank you, and I'm also speaking as a younger millennial. As someone who's part of both mainline and non-denominational, red, evangelical, a division I see in both circles is people who are more, say, justice focused, and then there are people who are more, let's just focus on evangelizing and discipleship, no more, no less, done. And there's this constant like, well, you're not justice focused enough, and I don't want to talk about politics, I just want to hear the gospel. And I'm wondering, how do you bring those together so they're not like polar opposites, but they work together?
Yeah. I'm going to go to Kristin for that, but I also want to say, the reason I still use that word smallly evangelical is Jesus' definition of that at his opening gig, his Nazareth manifesto, when he quoted Isaiah and said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news. The word there is evangel, from which we get evangelical evangelism, to the poor. So in the text, what the gospel is what's important here. Any gospel, according to Jesus, that isn't good news to the poor, whatever else it may be, it's not the gospel of Jesus Christ, period. Do you want to speak to that?
I'll just quickly add to that I would want to peel back some layers there on the just evangelism piece. Because I think a lot of times since you mentioned kind of evangelical spaces, a lot of times inside these evangelical, and this is true for some of the mainline spaces too, I am not political here. And then I'll go into those churches and I'll hear prayers against big government, and prayers thanking God for the anointing of Brett Kavanaugh was one Sunday when I went into a church that was super not political, right? We're totally not political. So what is that evangelism? What are you converting people to? There's often this myth of pure gospel, soul saving. It always comes packaged with a social and political vision of human flourishing, and so I just want to bring that to the surface, and then add to what Jim has said, and then have that conversation.
I think your question raises an interesting issue, because it was a legitimate, I think, critique of the liberal or progressive church for a long time, that I go into church and all I hear is politics. And I am in church not for politics, okay, we got to worry about it. You can't avoid it, and you have an obligation to it. But I go into church to understand God, to understand the meaning of life, to live a spiritual life. I think now that problem may exist on the other side. I am really taken by Raphael Warnock's book. If you never looked at it, it's a really interesting book. It's called The Divided Mind of the Black Church, Theology, Piety, and Public Witness. And I think that congregations really struggle with this problem and trying to do both, trying to have real witness, but also trying to enrich people's spiritual lives, ask them questions, get themselves to ask themselves questions. And I think this is a challenge across our, this isn't a problem we can just blame on one side or the other. I think this is a real problem across our traditions.
My answer to that question is really to remind people that if evangelism is sharing the good news of Jesus, perhaps the best way to get to know Jesus is to do what Jesus said do, and to demonstrate who is Jesus, what does Jesus mean. Because Jesus said these things, I do these things for you. That to me is evangelism, showing the world who Jesus is, and that you can't have one without the other, but that both of those things are a part of showing the world who Jesus is. So that's my answer to that.
Jesus said, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do the things that I say. Now, I see all the hands. The good news is we have another day of this, whole conversation tomorrow with lots of chance to talk. I want to take a couple more, and I like to, let's put the question in the form of a question, which is always a good idea. And then I want to just maybe a couple of questions and then have some response. Then we're going to get to what keeps you awake at night. So, right here.
I appreciate so much of I haven't read the whole document, but the headlines, and especially the first one on Imago Dei and human dignity. But I want your comment, because when I read the document and other church and faith leaders speaking on our democratic situation or political situation, sometimes I see what is missing is the comment on culture. And it was a former senator who spoke to a group of Episcopal clergy. I'm an Episcopal priest and a graduate of this institution, the Georgetown, that what religious leaders need to focus on is how to move the culture, because the culture is what moves our political system. And Reverend Owens' comment about rugged individualism, for example, or anything else, EJ talking about identities of different immigrants over history, has always been about what is America. Having spent a lot of years in Catholic schools, I know everyone has this ethnic group, and they were oppressed, and then they became white. And then they were acceptable.
That is very
and that's
true
the culture.
if you look even at the cartoons of the immigrant groups and how they changed over the years.
And Henry Ford's company used to have schools that take immigrants and make them into an ideal American, meaning white. So the question is, how do we shape culture in a way? You talk multiracial, multi-faith democracy. It's multicultural in this sense that what is it to be American is my question, and how, and maybe it's in the fine print.
Hold that. One more here. I need a woman's hand up. Where are we? There we go.
My question is just, what does discipleship mean then?
Okay.
What are we doing that we're not doing, and that 71 million people are saying, I think I'm going to vote for that. Can't hear you. I think I'm going to vote for that because that aligns with my theological understanding. We're not doing something.
Discipleship became the issue in so many of our conversations. What does public discipleship mean? Thoughts? Either question. Quick
I think,
answers.
To your question about shaping the culture, democratic culture really is a thing, and to identify it as a multicultural issue, I think is very important. Danielle Allen's work has been really instructive for me on this issue. I love how she uses, instead of a metaphor for oneness for our democracy, she talks about wholeness and the reconstitution of a democratic society that, you know, has been formed in different practices of citizenship, and that as we bring that together, the goal is not to just kind of elide one way of being and like, okay, well, we need to get rid of my Abuelita Guadalupe's way of being, you know, a participant in our society, you know, and privilege, you know, this one over here. It's how do all of those come together and be, and how can they be woven together into a whole society?
I would say read the statement as an answer to your question. The statement to me, I would call it, it's a statement about public discipleship. What does that look like? What does that mean? So I'd like to take the question right to the statement.
Could I say something on the culture
Please.
question, which I think is an excellent question? There's many of you probably know this. There's a famous quote from Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He said, "The central conservative truth is that it is culture, not politics, that determines the success of a society. The central liberal truth is that politics can change a culture and save it from itself." And I think that thinking hard about the interaction of culture and politics is really important. And think about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You know, at the time, a lot of the critics, the opponents, said you can't legislate morality. Somebody old enough to remember can remember people saying that over and over again. Passing the Civil Rights Act in 1964 did not end all evils in our society, but it really did fundamentally reorder the way people started thinking about race. It made an enormous difference that was initially in the law and in practice. It ended legal segregation, or tried hard to, as best the federal government could when it was really putting its shoulder to the wheel. But it also fundamentally changed the way people think about race over time. And so I think thinking about that interaction between, and politics can make culture worse or better, which is something else to think about, but I really appreciated your question.
We're ready. Go ahead, go ahead.
Well, quickly, I'd like to hear the answer to that final question. It is 46 days until the election. And I'd like to know what keeps each of you up at night right now, and where do you find hope these days? Now, this is not just your gut response to that question. What really is keeping you up at night? And then we'll after we hear our panel, we'll talk about what's next tonight and tomorrow. But you want to start?
Yeah. So thinking of November 6th and wondering if I will have wished I had done more.
Say again?
Wondering if I will have wished I had done more. So looking ahead to November 6th. When it feels discouraging, when it feels wearying, as a historian who knows how history unfolds, I know it could potentially be much more wearying in the days ahead, depending on what we do or do not accomplish between now and November 5. And so that's one thing that keeps me up. And I frankly hope to keep some more people up with that same thought. And then what gives me hope is community. I already referenced fellow co-laborers in this room. And we've talked some about fear and about backlash and about, you know, pulling back and all of the risks of taking a stand. And this is a document that calls people to courage. And what I can say is I know people who have lost their jobs, who have lost their incomes, who are estranged from their families, who have paid prices already. The prices may get steeper depending on what happens, but I know of nobody who has regretted taking the stand that they have taken. And so that gives me hope in community and courage in community.
So what keeps me up at night? A few weeks ago, it kind of flew under the radar, but it caught my attention. J.D. Vance said at a rally, "Professors are the enemy." I work at a school where there has been a school shooting that has resulted in the murder and the death of 3 of our students already. Political violence in schools. School shootings are political violence, and it's already happening. So to have said that, for whatever the reasons were, whatever the thought of political feedback was, really, it really caught me and kind of, probably was seeking to generate the nightmare machine, but that really does scare me as someone who works in education, and that's, of course, connected to the other forms of political violence that could manifest in the days either leading up to or after the election. What gives me hope is Kamala Harris's blended families Sunday dinners. I love that. I love the video where she tells her niece, Mina, she needs to learn how to effing cook. Because, again, as an elder millennial, it's taken me a while to really do, but I love to cook. So I've adopted the Sunday dinner tradition, or readopted it, for my own little family. I'm trying to convince other people to come and have dinner with us. But speaking of shaping culture, that's one powerful way that Kamala Harris has shaped the culture thus far. And I love it. We've already done it a couple of times, and I just want to have Sunday dinners, and I want a president who has Sunday dinners.
I think what keeps me up mostly because I'm now at a certain age where I realize that generations behind me are devoid of history of how we got here. And they're responding out of an ignorance of that history. And so they are comfortable being silent, and they're comfortable being on the sidelines. And how do we shake them up? And you know, as one human being with limited time and treasure and talent and all those things, trying to make sure that I'm plugged in, that the organization I lead is plugged in to things to both educate and awaken and move us out of this apathy. I think that's the biggest concern I had, that the silence and the apathy and the ignorance of our younger generations. I grew up, my dad was an African-American studies professor, and my grandfather was a Baptist preacher. I had to read a book a week by or about black people, or I didn't get half of my allowance. And so when people were saying, oh, who is that black poet at Virginia Tech who read the poem? I'm like, wait a minute, you don't know who Nikki Giovanni is? I mean, it's that you don't understand. Oh, I'm not going to vote. Or I like one of these candidates because, yeah, he's a boss. And you don't understand that people literally struggled, bled, and died so that you can be where they are. The apathy, as Dr. Skinner said, will have impact for me, my son, and my grandson. And so what am I doing to awaken and shake that apathy and move people to action? What gives me hope? I wear this little necklace, and Philippians 1:6, Paul tells the Philippians, I am confident in this, that the one who began the good work in you will be faithful to complete it. My confidence can't be in all you good people, as wonderful as you are, and that's where my faith really becomes alive. The word to Esther, even from her cousin, her uncle, to say, Esther, you could choose not to do this, but if you do it, God will raise up others who will accomplish the things that I have accomplished. And so the work has to be done, and I'm working on a lot of different levels to help get the work done, but my faith gives me hope.
So I'm going to preface what I say just by saying something about the statement, which is when you read it, it doesn't have a party in it, doesn't have any candidates in it. And my real hope for this statement is not just that people will agree with us, but maybe some people will disagree with us. But I hope we can open up space, help in our modest way. It's a statement. You never know what a statement does, but we might open up space for some conversations among people who may not agree on everything, might disagree fundamentally. So because my answer is so tied to the election, I wanted to preface it with that. A nightmare is that enough people will vote for a candidate who says he wants to deport every single immigrant who is undocumented in the country, who could do something like happened in Springfield. This is not like voting for another conservative candidate. This is not just about anger about the economy, which you can get. I understand why people are unhappy about that. This would really trouble me this would trouble my view of my own country, because I just don't think that's who we are. And what gives me hope is that I find it really interesting that Harris is running a "we have more in common than divides us" campaign. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how that campaign works going forward, because I really, really, really want to believe that about we Americans, that in the end, despite our divisions, despite our capacity for sinfulness that Chris and I keep emphasizing, that we really do find ways of emphasizing how do we deal with common problems, how do we work together again. And I love the fact that young people have been started to get remobilized in politics, and for the long run, that is really important to the democracy.
So if I may, a moderator's answer to the final question is I look at this more and more spiritually and not just politically, and that every nation does have its better angels and its worst demons. And our demons of race in this country run so deep. So my fear is about that battle between our better angels, which are there, and our worst demons. My hope is that a lot of us are in conversations all across the country, and will be all the way up to the election and afterwards. And the conversations are going well. And people are wanting to have those conversations at Sunday dinner with their families and friends and congregations. And just so we all don't feel like we've not done enough, because I feel that every day too. My son says, Dad, just give your 2 cents. Give your 2 cents. And I told him, that's good to remind me, give my 2 cents. And I believe in a God who multiplies our 2 cents in ways that we can't predict or control or even understand. I hope the statement helps spark a conversation. I hope this evening helps spark a conversation. And we're going to have more of that for the next day, all day tomorrow. The conversation will continue. Could you help us thank these panelists? As we conclude tonight, I again want to invite you to join us on the 9th floor. It's called the Capitol View Room. It's really cool. A reception will follow, and we'll have some refreshments up there, more questions, more conversation. And I hope you can join us again tomorrow. We start at 9 a.m. and we'll conclude by 4 p.m. So give yourselves some applause for tonight. See you upstairs.